Hi everyone and welcome back to the HSC Network podcast. This week we're joined by Henry Mooney of EcoOnline and we're going to be answering some of the most frequently asked questions when it comes to the COSHH regulations in 2021. Cool, perfect. Well, thank you very much for coming on the show, Henry. Can you start off by giving us an introduction into yourself and your position within EcoOnline?
Yeah, thank you, David. Delighted to be joining you today. I could go back to, I graduated with a degree in environmental science, and from that I worked with a company called ITW. We manufactured over 1,000 different adhesives, glues, solvent paints, and we had over 1,200 raw materials. So I worked there up to the European Health and Safety Manager. You know what I mean? So we generated generally huge vats, or we had reactors also, and we had batches up to maybe 2,000 liters. So there was significant exposure there to, lots of different dangerous substances. From there, then I joined EcoOnline. For the past 15 years, and I'm providing advice to organizations across all sectors on all aspects associated with dangerous substances, whether it's the REACH and GHS regulations, the COSHH and the ZEERS regulations, or the transport regulations. That's me.
Perfect. Well, yeah, thanks again for coming on the show. I think today we're going to have a little bit of a discussion around COSHH. We've asked our listeners to submit what their sort of burning COSHH questions are, if you like. And obviously, we've had a bit of back and forth with yourself about what you think would be good to cover. Can you start off by giving us maybe an overview of the COSHH regulations?
Okay, yeah, very good. A good start. So what is the COSHH? The COSHH is a UK piece of legislation, and what it does is it requires employers to control substances that are hazardous to health. So to protect and to reduce the exposure of their staff to hazardous substances. And hazardous substances can be chemicals that you're working with, they can be biological agents, can be dusts or powders that you're working with, but also can be processes, maybe the likes of grinding. And what it does, it places an emphasis on the employer to identify what are the hazards, what are the different chemicals, for example, that are hazardous, then to complete a risk assessment on the safe use of those chemical products or hazardous substances, to implement the control measures that come out of the risk assessment, to provide information and instruction and training to their staff on the safe use of those chemical products or hazardous substances, to put emergency response procedures in place. So there's a whole, list of things that companies and organizations need to do to make sure that they comply with the COSHH regulations. And COSHH, what does it stand for? It stands for Control of Substances Hazardous to Health. So we're very much, when we look at chemicals, we're looking at how they can affect your health. So are you talking about, for example, corrosive to your skin, corrosive to your eyes, irritating by inhalation? Is it toxic? And I suppose when it comes to health, then you can have acute health effects. So something could be toxic by inhalation, where you go into a room and you inhale the substance because of a high enough concentration, you go unconscious and you could die as a result of it. Or there's other chemicals that have chronic health effects, where you will develop symptoms over a longer period of time, over weeks, months, or years. And the employer has, duties to protect their workers from those hazardous chemicals.
There's a lot of scope and depth to the regulations, and you summed it up brilliantly there. What would you say are the top line things that employers need to know about the regulations?
So, if I look at what are the key things that they need to do, so they need to look at, first of all, creating a list or an inventory of the chemicals that they use within the organization. They need then to complete the risk assessment. They need to make sure that those actions that come out of the risk assessment are implemented. They need to provide instructions and training to staff on the safe use of those chemicals. If required, they have to complete occupational monitoring of the safe use of chemicals. And they also need to make sure that they have processes and procedures in place in the event of an emergency. Maybe to start off with, what would be the first thing that you need to do to comply with the COSHH regulations? I would say that the first thing you need to do is as I say, create that list of your hazardous substances created by department, and then to source the safety data sheet. Okay, so once you source the safety data sheet, then you will be able to identify the hazards, because in section 2 of the safety data, you identify what are the hazards of the substance. Once you've identified the hazards, then you complete your chemical risk assessment or your COSHH risk assessment. Following that, then you'll identify some controls you need to put into place. You might identify the type of PPE that your staff need to wear. You might identify that you need to put in an eye wash station. But whatever you identify, then you need to implement those control measures. Once you've implemented control measures, then you need to provide training to staff. How do they safely use the chemicals? What are the hazards associated with the chemicals? And as part of completing that risk assessment, you also need to look at other aspects such as emergency response, both control measures and mitigation measures.
So why do we need to complete a COSHH risk assessment if we have a safety data sheet for a chemical?
I get asked that quite a lot at a lot of courses. The safety data sheet, what is it? It's a 16-section health and safety information sheet that's provided by the manufacturer of the chemical or substance. And they're providing that with specific information, which sometimes can be generic, that they're providing it then to all users. So whether you're using 1,000 liters of that chemical, if it's corrosive, or you're using a liter of it, you have access to the same information on the safety data sheet. What the risk assessment done, or the COSHH risk assessment does, is it looks at how are you using the chemical within your organization and the control measures that you need to put in place. So if a member of staff is exposed to 1,000 liters versus 1 liter, the control measures will be significantly different. So you really need to take into account how you are using that chemical product.
Yeah, and the control measures, I guess, would differ between industries as well, wouldn't they?
Oh, yes, absolutely. So, a chemical could be used across various different sectors and used in different ways. Even within the same organization, you could be using, for example, a cleaning product in one department, you could be using a significant amount of it. And in a laboratory, you could be using very small quantities. You need to do 2 separate COSHH assessments for those different processes.
Great. Well, I think we'll move on to our first question from the audience, which is, sometimes safety data sheets can be of poor quality. What do you do in those situations? What do we do when there are poor safety data sheets, Henry?
Yes, safety data sheets, sometimes when they come in from the manufacturers, they can be of poor quality. And what I would say is a couple of key points there. When you're sourcing your safety data sheets, is what we say is it's go directly to get it from the manufacturer. Because if you're getting it from maybe your downstream supplier or your distributor, it may have been a while since they got the up-to-date safety data sheet from the manufacturer. So by going straight to the manufacturer, you're sourcing the most current safety data sheet. Second thing I would say then is that the employer has a legal obligation to provide their staff with a safety data sheet, but there's also a legal duty on the manufacturer or supplier of the product to supply you with a safety data sheet which is compliant with the UK regulations. And if they're not complying with the UK regulations, well, then you may need to look to get your product from a different supplier, because they may not just be a reputable company that is providing you with the safety data sheet that you need.
Brilliant. Well, now we've covered sort of safety data sheets. We'll move on to the next question, which looks at COSHH risk assessments. Henry, what are some of the biggest mistakes you see when reviewing COSHH risk assessments?
When reviewing COSHH assessments, what I see is, first of all, probably is, if I look at is the template, is that the template that's generated can be 7 or 8 pages long. And what I find then is that it's quite a cumbersome task to complete the risk assessment. You know, there's a huge amount of information to be filled in. And also then, employees are using the chemicals aren't interested in reading them. So what I would say is to get your template, get it right, keep it concise and short so that it's easy to complete the risk assessment and also then easy for it to be read and understood by your staff. What I also find is how you go about doing your risk assessments, and it's key there that you involve the key employees within the department or the organization that are using the chemical. And what I find one of the best ways for completing your chemical assessments, maybe in each key department to have maybe 2 key employees who will take responsibility for completing the COSHH risk assessment, and then they may be signed off by the health and safety department.
And I guess it's about making the, like you say, making the risk assessments as easy to fill in as possible to increase compliance.
Yes, absolutely. When it's easy to read and understand, you'll have greater engagement from the employees and greater involvement. And that's why I would see if you can try and keep your template to 2 or 3 pages. The other thing I would say about completing the COSHH risk assessment, another maybe mistake I see is that very often I see that the information is maybe copied from the safety data sheet over directly into the COSHH risk assessment, and they don't take into account the specific quantities that you are using on site. So for example, it might say in a safety data sheet wear a full bodysuit, but if they're using only 10 mils, maybe adequate to have an apron and a pair of goggles. So very important that you take into account how you are using and how you are applying that product within your organization.
Brilliant. And the next question is, how often do the risk assessments need to be updated?
Okay, another very good question.
FAQ.
Yes, yeah, that's a great question. I get it, and it is. So if I complete a new chemical has arrived on site and I complete a COSHH risk assessment, and I identify that there are a significant number of additional control measures or mitigation measures that I need to implement. So maybe I might have 5 or 6 actions. Well, then I might say I'm going to implement these, and then I'm going to review the risk assessment. I'm going to review the risk assessment once I've implemented those. So I might put in the next date to be reviewed maybe in 3 months at time. Outside of that, then a lot of organizations will review their risk assessments, COSHH risk assessments on an annual basis. And I find that the bulk of the work is at the beginning in completing your COSHH assessments. Reviewing them then, generally there isn't a huge change in processes or procedures. So, reviewing it, when you review your risk assessments, you're really looking for the nuggets. So has there been a change in the classification? Has there been a change in the process? And you might find then, 1 or 2 things you need to tweak in the risk assessment and review the process. Other than that, then you really need to review your COSHH risk assessment if there is a change in the classification of the product. So a new safety data sheet arrives and the classification has changed from irritant to corrosive. You need to update your risk assessment then. Or another time is if you have a significant change in the process. So you were using 100 mils and now you're using a litre for the application. You really need to, at that point, update your COSHH risk assessment.
Brilliant. And the next question, I think it's one we've covered a little bit earlier, is how to get employees to follow the regulations in their work. With regards to risk assessments, as we said, it's making it as easy to follow as possible. But how about the wider regulations, Henry?
Yeah, so what I see as being key to really to implement and to get the staff involved is, the first thing I would say is training. Education and training is key. Make sure they know what are the hazards of the chemicals. You know what I mean? Can they identify this substance is corrosive, this substance is toxic, this substance is irritant, and what they really know the true meaning of that. Second thing I would say is engagement. So, you know, if you're implementing control measures, is to engage the staff. So, for example, if you now decide as part of your COSHH risk assessment that all staff in a certain department have to wear safety goggles, why not bring in 4 or 5 different types of safety goggles and ask staff which one do they prefer? If they like a pair, that they're more likely to wear it, wear the safety goggles. And then you got to look at, maybe on a higher level, look at the culture within your organization. Is there ongoing awareness and training? And if somebody in that department is not wearing the safety goggles, will somebody beside them say, here, listen, you're on the goggles there to protect your eyes? And that has to come from, you know, I mean, training all staff within the organization, but you know, having a strong ongoing focus in chemical safety and COSHH regulations, and simple things like having maybe an exercise at lunchtime, having a quiz, who knows what these hazards mean, just keeps it in their minds and keeps reminding them that, you know, these chemicals can be corrosive, they will cause burns.
And when you involve employees in that process, you know, it's something we find with other clients, is they take more ownership of it, don't they? That it naturally increases compliance.
Absolutely, and even back to the point of completing the COSHH risk assessments. If you have 2 key people in the department who have maybe received additional training for completing the COSHH risk assessments, you know, they're going to be leaders when it comes to chemical safety compliance, you know, because they've identified what we need to improve, and they will look to promote that. But yeah, absolutely, it will lead to greater compliance by having more engagement.
Next question, and it's another big one. Are the COSHH regulations impacted by Brexit at all?
Ooh, good question. Yes, so with Brexit, we are having changes to the key regulations are REACH and CLP regulations. REACH is registration, evaluation, authorization, and restriction of chemicals. And, you know, a new set of REACH UK regulations are being set up. And that's about really the registration of the chemicals to make sure, you know, to ensure that we can have a high level of protection to staff. And then we have the CLP regulations, the classification, labeling, and packaging. So that's how you classify the chemical. Is it corrosive? Has the label changed? Has the packaging that's required changed? So because the UK have introduced their own version of the REACH and CLP regulations, there will be a divergence from the EU regulations. And what we'll find is that it won't have a direct impact on the COSHH regulations, because the COSHH regulations are UK regulations, but it will have an indirect impact. So, for example, because the CLP regulations are changing, then safety data sheets will change, and they will diverge from EU safety data sheets. So you could have safety data sheet that will be classified different in the UK to the EU. So you'll need to make sure that your safety data sheets are UK compliant, and that then will have a knock-on effect, because it may change the hazards or that for completing your COSHH risk assessments.
Will the regulations change at all in the future now that Brexit is?
No, the COSHH regulations, I don't see a significant change to those regulations in the future, but certainly the REACH and CLP, there is a thought there that they will diverge from the EU regulations, and we will see then that will have a knock-on effect on the COSHH regulations.
Perfect. And yeah, I think we've covered some great stuff today, Henry. The last question that I want to finish on is, have you got any tips for small businesses that want to comply with the COSHH regulations?
Start off with the basics of start doing up your inventory. And when you're taking your inventory, make sure you get the actual name of the product, the product number from the manufacturer, and the manufacturer's details. Because then it just lays foundation then for sourcing the safety data sheet that is going to be the correct one that you're going to use then to complete your COSHH risk assessments. The other thing I would say, this is a small tip, is spill kits, for example. When you have spill kits, you're required to complete a check on the spill kits. But if you actually put a breakable tie on the closure of the spill kit, then you only need to check to make sure that tie is intact. So it kind of simplifies the process of completing that checks. Just a small tip to finish with.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much for joining us today, Henry. Where can people go if they want to get in touch with you or find out more about the solutions that EcoOnline provides?
Yes, yeah. So if you wish, you can check out our website. It's EcoOnline.com.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Henry. Take care.
Okay. Thank you, David.
Perfect. Thanks. Bye.